Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our second community office hours. Yep, held one 2 weeks ago. For those of you who joined us then, welcome back. And to give everyone who's attending for the first time a bit of context, I'm just going to quickly run through some introductions and tell you a bit about the purpose of the sessions. So my name is Tay. I'm the product marketing manager for Flyway, and I'm basically responsible for shaping up what our product marketing strategy is, how we're going to engage the community, that's you guys, and I'm joined today by the rest of the Flyway team. So we've got Johnny, Julia, Alex, and Mikkel. Just a bit of history. So initially, after acquiring Flyway, we started holding these sessions internally as a team. And the purpose of that was to show kind of the wider company exactly what we've been working on, get feedback on that to make sure that we're working on the right things and we're tracking in the right direction, basically. But we know at its core that Flyway is an open source project and it's got a really passionate community who've contributed massively to its success in the past. So we thought, why not open it up to the rest of the wider team, basically. So I'm going to be handing over the reins today to each of the guys I mentioned so they can tell you a little bit about the work that they've been doing and deliver kind of some technical demos and show you what that actually looks like in action. But just before I do that, let me direct you over to the question box. So that should be somewhere on your screen. As we go along, please just feel free to drop any and all questions you've got into that box. We will have some time at the end to address as many of those as we can. And I think there'll be some time after each person's done their little bit. So yeah, I don't think there's anything else. So I'll just hand over the controls to Alex now.
Okay, well, so I'm Alex. I'm one of the developers on the team, and we're going to talk about some of the headline features for 6.1. One of them being transaction override, the other one being skip command, and finally Snowflake support. So I'm going to start talking about transaction override and then hand over to Mikkel to talk about skip, and then Julia's going to talk about Snowflake. So Flyway normally will always try to detect whether a script can be run inside of a transaction or not, and then it will wrap in a transaction accordingly. But sometimes there are some complex scenarios where that's harder to detect or nearly impossible to detect. So we decided to offer a way for users to be able to override this detection and just tell us whether they want that script to be run inside the transaction or not run inside of a transaction at all. So the way it works is at the moment we read the contents of the script and then it goes through this detection process. And then if we think that it's okay to run that inside of a transaction, then we favor that and then we wrap the script in the transaction before running it. But if you think that you know better, that you want to run outside of a transaction for some reason, or just because the script doesn't run inside of a transaction, then you can provide some script configuration to tell Flyway not to run that script inside of a transaction. And this is kind of introducing a new concept that I'm going to show a little bit and talk a bit more about in a minute. But we expect that this might be able to be used for other things in the future. So this is a new thing we introduced into Flyway. Similarly, it might be that Flyway detects that script cannot be run inside the transaction, but you also think you know better, and then you can say in the script configuration that you want to wrap it in a transaction and run it like so. So I'm going to give a quick demo of what that looks like in the product. So let's say we have a migration script that creates a procedure, and inside of that procedure, I'm running something that normally wouldn't be able to run inside of a transaction. So in here, for instance, I have this commit statement that if I try to run this whole script inside of a transaction, it will fail. And then we'll see that in a minute. And then the reason why this will fail is because I'm calling that procedure in here. And then if the whole script runs inside of a transaction, Postgres will think that that commit relates to the transaction that Flyway opened, and that's going to fail. So I'm just going to show that I'm connected to a Postgres database here, and then this script is showing as pending. So if I try to migrate this script, then it says that it fails, and then it says that there's an invalid transaction termination. So as I mentioned, it's interpreting that commit inside of that procedure as being the commit for the transaction that Flyway has opened. And in this case, this procedure is valid and Postgres, but because this is being called from the same migration, it's harder for us to detect that this commit is being actually called as opposed to just being declared inside of the procedure, which would be absolutely fine. So in this case, what you can do is to create a configuration for this script. And the way to go about it is to create a new file alongside the migration in this case, but this also applies to callbacks and repeatable migrations as well. And then you just append the .conf extension to the name, and that becomes the configuration for that script. And in this case, I'm going to use the option execute in transaction. And I'm going to say that I want it to not execute in a transaction, so I'm going to set that to false. And now if I try to run migrate again, it will read that configuration, and then instead of trying to wrap the script in a transaction, it won't. So this should succeed. Oh, hang on a minute. Not execution, it's execute in transaction. Try again, and then you can see that it runs successfully. So this is the way we came up with. You can see that there's some consistency with Flyway conf, so it's the same format you might be used to when specifying your config in the Flyway conf. And then hopefully in the future we'll be adding more things that you can override or tweaks that you can do to specific migrations using the same mechanism. Right, so before I hand over to Mikkel, are there any questions at this point?
None at the moment from anyone watching in, but I do have a brief one from me, which is
Okay.
if you could just go back to your VS Code editor.
Sure.
So obviously when you create this file, it's not templated, it's blank. Is there any documentation or hints towards what I would need to type in here? For example, if I wanted to execute within the transaction, or
I see.
within the transaction.
If there was another, I see what you mean. Like if there was another setting, how would I discover that?
Yes.
Yeah. So this hasn't been released yet. So this is a feature that's going to come in 6.1. So it will be documented in the website. We are thinking about the best way to make this more discoverable. So for instance, in the Flyway conf, when you install Flyway, the Flyway conf will have loads of commented out options. So we're thinking of a way that to make this more visible, so that people understand that they can do that. Perhaps it will be as part of an error message that will say, well, maybe you can use the execute in transaction option and the script configuration, and then link to the documentation. So we're still thinking of the best way to advertise this feature, if that makes sense. But yeah, we'll definitely try to hook up to some of the error messages or examples in the installation directory or something like that.
Cool. But in the meantime, when we put this out in 6.1 in the release notes, we'll have a link to documentation and
Yes.
like the syntax for doing this.
Yeah, that's correct.
Cool. Thank you, Alex.
Okay, no problem. So at this point, I'm going to hand over to Mikkel, who's going to talk about the skip command.
Cool. Yeah. So I'm Mikkel. I'm another developer on the Flyway team. So for the next release, we're introducing a new command called skip, which allows you to skip certain migrations in specific environments. The motivation for this was that users had asked for it. It was a fairly popular issue on GitHub. And there was one major use case that people were trying to solve, which was how you deal with adding an ad hoc sort of out of process change. So you can imagine a scenario where you do a deployment and you have to do a hotfix on production, maybe something's gone wrong. It's an emergency, so you do it quickly, you don't create a migration in Flyway. And then the question is, okay, how do I now get those changes back into my Flyway process? So what the skip command will allow you to do is apply that ad hoc change to your database. And then you can, once that's working, you can then create a script that represents that change as a normal migration. and then you can run the skip command, which will say, okay, skip this sort of hotfix migration on production. So what that means is it won't be run again on the hotfix database, but you could still apply it into your lower environments. So that means you can now bring those sort of ad hoc changes into your Flyway process. So that's one of the major use cases for this feature. So as we were developing this new functionality, we realized that the existing baseline command is sort of a limited version of what this skip command is. So with baseline, you can say, oh, I want to ignore all migrations below a certain version, and you'd use that for your initial sort of deployment when you're setting up Flyway the first time. So it seems a bit redundant to have both skip and baseline. So we're thinking that skip should just expand on the current capabilities of baseline. Baseline will be marked as deprecated and eventually removed in Flyway version 7. Yeah, so there's a diagram here of how conceptually skip could work. So on the left-hand side, you have a representation of your database, and you have 3 migrations which are pending, v1, 2, and 3. So you run skip, and you can say, okay, I want to skip version 1 and 2. So on the right-hand side, they're now marked as being skipped in your database. The version 3 is still pending. So you can imagine a scenario where maybe this is a new database. It already has some stuff deployed to it. So you write 2 scripts, v1 and 2, that represent those changes that are already in your database. And then you say, okay, I've got these scripts, but I want them to be skipped for this one. So you just run skip with v1 and 2. So that's sort of covering that initial baseline scenario. You could also imagine a scenario where maybe v1 is deployed, you want to skip v2 for whatever reason. Maybe it's a hotfix, maybe it doesn't quite work for that environment for whatever weird reason. So that's also fine. You can just arbitrarily say, okay, just ignore this one for now. So we've got a post on the GitHub page about this, which sort of summarizes these faults. This also contains the whole community discussion and the various ideas that have been suggested about this problem. So you can read that. You can also feel free to comment if you have any other faults. So obviously deprecating the baseline command is a fairly significant change. We think it's the right thing, but if that's undesirable for you, you have strong opinions about it, then please feel free to get in contact with us through the usual channels of Twitter, email, or on GitHub. Yeah, I think that's mainly it for the skip command. I suppose we can see if there are any questions about that.
Yeah, one from Eduardo who's listening. He asks, what happens when you unskip a migration?
You unskip a migration. So the unskip scenario is something that we are still not 100% sure about. We have considered that maybe you'll want to unskip, but we're thinking really it's sort of a one-time, so you can't really unskip a migration. If people want it, we find that it's necessary, then we will rethink that decision.
Okay, and Steve's suggesting that skip wouldn't be a one-time for him either. So it sounds to me like we'd need a bit more information about the 2 cases being imagined here. Steve and Eduardo on the screen at the moment is the issue tracker for Flyway, and particularly for this issue 1986. I wonder if you could. It'd be really helpful to get a bit more information on that issue regarding your questions around that. We're really looking for a conversation around the skip command and particularly around the deprecation process for baseline. But if you have cases you can imagine that we might not have considered, then any information you can add in there would be really appreciated. But thank you for your questions. Thanks. Okay, Julie, I think this is you.
You can hear me now?
Yes.
Cool. So the third thing we're going to put into version 6.1 is support for Snowflake. Snowflake is a growing cloud data warehouse provider. It looks largely like most SQL databases. Typically connects to a nice web UI. You can run SQL scripts against it. It has a reasonably standard SQL interface. It does have some rather unusual features in that, as you can see on the screen, instead of querying a table which contains data about the other tables, it has commands like show tables and show schemas. It does some rather unusual things around default schemas and roles. It automatically uppercases column names unless you explicitly punctuate them correctly. And it has an interesting feature, which is that you can undrop tables. So this has given us a bit of work to make sure we're recognizing all the different keywords, which is why if needed some extra development on top of the existing Flyway code base. Now, we had a couple of contributors who submitted Snowflake support for v5.0 and v5.2. I'm afraid we haven't been able to use those, partly because there's been a lot of change in Flyway itself up to version 6, which would mean basically starting again. And also, in one case, the contributions didn't have a signed CLA. And that's a reminder for anyone who does want to contribute to the open source part of Flyway. We do need signed CLAs before we can accept anything into the code base, I'm afraid. But essentially, Snowflake with Flyway works like any other database. Just give it script files that it can recognize, run them through migrations, and it all works. We have got ourselves a full account with Snowflake to do testing, and that's been the other thing that's held us back somewhat. But yes, it is all fully tested, and we will be very interested to hear how you get on with it. Again, any questions?
No, none from outside of the team, and I don't have any other questions other than, is there anything particular, any changes that are specific to Snowflake in terms of getting up and running in terms of the Flyway configuration, or is it all broadly?
It's pretty much the same as any other database. The way you use Flyway is the same. You will need to download the JDBC driver from Snowflake, at least to begin with. That's rather like Oracle and DB2, where we don't have the rights to redistribute it, but we are talking to Snowflake, and that may well be provided soon. If we can do it, then we'll do it as soon as possible.
Great. And again, I guess the any sort of help and release and documentation notes will go out with the, well, documentation notes will go out with the release notes.
Yes, indeed. It'll all be on the documentation site.
Perfect. And in terms of release, I don't think we've actually, I know we haven't mentioned on the issue, but it's the 26th of November. We're hoping to get 6.1.
That's our intention at the moment, yes.
Yep. Great.
Okay. Cool. Thanks everyone for taking us through some of the features that are coming up in 6.1. I think I'll pause here for another minute, just to see if we get any other questions coming in, kind of everything you've seen, or any other questions about Flyway. So.
Just one comment from Eduardo. Thanks. Eduardo says it feels like skip and baseline have different meanings and use cases. I think I suspect in this case it would be helpful for us to kind of provide some definition to those, and again example use cases, so that we've become sort of a bit tighter on the terminology. So I think that's a nice suggestion. Thanks. Thanks, Eduardo.
Okay. I think if there's nothing else, we'll probably wrap up the session. So yeah, as I mentioned in the beginning, this is still only the second office hours we've done. So we're hoping that it's useful. We're hoping that people are finding even the recordings useful to go back to. We'd like to do more in the future and perhaps keep it on the cadence of one every other week. So, we're relying a lot on your feedback. Tell us if this has been useful for you guys, and tell us what you'd like to see more of. So you can kind of reach us through all the usual channels. Just tweet us at FlywayDB, comment on our milestones on GitHub. And actually, I'll be reaching out to everyone who attended the session just personally via email. So if you have any feedback you'd like to give, just contact me that way as well. Just going to ask the team one more time, anything we missed, anything else we want to mention?
No.
All right.
Nope. I think we're covered.
Brilliant. Okay, perfect. Thanks everyone, and see you next time.
See you next time.
Yeah.
Thanks everybody.